It is February 1983 in the quiet, unassuming neighborhood of Muswell Hill, North London. The residents of 23 Cranley Gardens are annoyed. For days, the plumbing has been backing up. A foul, unyielding odor permeates the Victorian townhouse. The tenants complain to the landlord, and a plumber from Dino Rod is dispatched. He pries open the manhole cover at the side of the house, expecting to find the usual blockage of leaves or household waste. Instead, peering into the dark, murky water, he shines his flashlight on something pale, fleshy, fibrous. He initially dismisses it as the discarded remains of a meal, perhaps Kentucky Fried Chicken. But the bones are too large. The texture is wrong. When the police arrive and extract the blockage, the grim, unimaginable truth is laid bare on the pavement. These are not animal remains. They are human, and they have been flushed down from the top floor flat. The flat occupied by a quiet, polite civil servant named Dennis Nilsen. What began as a mundane domestic complaint was about to unravel into one of the most horrific, chilling, and deeply sorrowful chapters in the history of true crime. This is not just a story of murder, it is a descent into the profound, suffocating depths of absolute loneliness and the monstrous acts it birthed. The drain at Cranley Gardens. The discovery in the drain set off a quiet, methodical panic among the authorities. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was summoned to the scene. The flesh was undeniably human, and the pipe led directly upward to the attic apartment. The police had a location, but they needed the occupant. They waited. They did not have to wait long. Evening fell, and walking up the street returning from another ordinary day at his job at the local job center was Dennis Nilsen. He was 37 years old, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a shirt and tie, carrying the quiet demeanor of a man who blended perfectly into the gray backdrop of London. When the detectives approached him outside his door, Nilsen did not run. He did not fight. He was calmly informed of the blockage in the drains. The police asked to enter his flat. Nilsen agreed, unlocking the door and leading the detectives up the stairs. As soon as the door to the attic flat swung open, DCIJ was hit by an invisible wall. The smell inside the apartment was overpowering, the undeniable heavy scent of putrefying flesh, masked poorly by chemical deodorizers and boiling pots. The flat was sparsely furnished but strangely tidy. The detectives asked Nilsen where the rest of the body was. Nilsen, with a terrifying, chilling calmness, simply pointed to a wardrobe. Inside were 2 black plastic bin bags. They were heavy, weeping fluid. On the journey to the police station, the detectives sat in stunned silence with their suspect. DCIJ, trying to grasp the scale of the horror, asked a question that would echo through history. Are we talking about 1 body or 2? Nilsen stared out the window of the police car, watching the London streets roll by. Without breaking his gaze, he replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. In that single softly spoken sentence, Dennis Nilsen shifted from an anonymous bureaucrat to Britain's most prolific known serial killer of the era. He had been hiding in plain sight, living with the dead, operating a slaughterhouse behind the closed doors of 2 ordinary London homes. To understand how a man reaches the point where he can boil human heads on his kitchen stove, we must look backward. We must look to the bitter, sweeping coastlines of Scotland, and to a little boy who learned very early that the only people who never leave you are the dead. The boy from Fraserburgh. The making of Dennis Nilsen begins in Fraserburgh, a harsh, windswept fishing town on the northeast coast of Scotland. Born in 1945, Nilsen was the second of 3 children. His father, a Norwegian soldier, was a distant, fleeting presence who ultimately abandoned the family, leaving Nilsen's mother, Betty, to raise the children. Betty was a pragmatic, emotionally reserved woman, hardened by the environment and the times. Affection was not freely given in the Nilsen household. Young Dennis, known as Des, was a quiet, introverted child, desperately seeking a connection he could not find in his immediate family. He found that connection in his grandfather, Andrew White. Andrew was a towering figure in young Dennis's life, a deeply religious, steadfast fisherman who provided the only warmth and genuine affection the boy knew. To Dennis, his grandfather was the anchor in a turbulent, cold world. But in 1951, when Dennis was just 6 years old, That anchor was violently torn away. Andrew White died of a heart attack at sea. The profound trauma of this loss was compounded by the way it was handled. In accordance with local tradition, Andrew's body was brought home and laid out in the parlor for viewing. Betty, perhaps thinking she was doing the right thing, or perhaps simply following the rigid customs of the era, brought young Dennis into the room to say goodbye. The boy was urged to look at the man he loved more than anyone else. But the man was no longer there. In his place was a cold, pale, motionless figure. For a 6-year-old child, already starved of affection, this moment was psychologically catastrophic. In the fragile architecture of Dennis Nilsen's developing mind, wires crossed. The deepest, purest love he had ever experienced became inextricably linked with the image of a cold, silent, unresponsive body. Death and love became permanently fused. The dead, he learned in that parlor, are peaceful. They do not judge, they do not abandon, and they stay exactly where you leave them. This subconscious association would lie dormant for decades, a terrifying seed planted in the fertile ground of his profound isolation. As he grew older, Nilsen realized he was homosexual. In the conservative, tightly knit community of 1950s and 60s Scotland, this was an agonizing secret. It further alienated him from his peers and his family. He retreated into himself, building a facade of normalcy, while suffocating beneath the weight of his own hidden identity. He would take long, solitary walks along the sea cliffs, staring out at the water that had taken his grandfather, cultivating a deep, romanticized melancholy. He was a ghost long before he started making them. A life in uniform. Desperate to escape Fraserburgh and the stifling atmosphere of his youth, Nilsen did what many young men in his position did. He joined the military. In 1961, at the age of 16, he enlisted in the Army Catering Corps. The military provided structure, a sense of belonging, and a uniform to hide behind. It was a place where individuality was suppressed, which suited a man who wanted to keep his true self hidden. His time in the army took him across the world, from Germany to the Middle East. It was here that two critical elements of his future modus operandi were forged. First, as a cook and a butcher, Nilsen learned how to dismantle an animal. He became intimately familiar with bone, muscle, and sinew. He learned how to sever joints, how to manage blood, and how to reduce a large, complex organism into manageable, anonymous pieces. It was a purely clinical skill, taught for the purpose of feeding troops, but it was knowledge that would later be applied with horrifying precision to human beings. Second, the army enforced his isolation. While homosexuality had been partially decriminalized in civilian life in 1967, it remained strictly prohibited in the armed forces. Discovery meant immediate dishonorable discharge and public ruin. Nilsen was forced to suppress his desires completely, engaging only in fleeting, highly secretive, and deeply dangerous encounters. He could not form lasting, meaningful relationships. He watched his fellow soldiers bond, marry, and build lives, while he remained an outsider, observing the warmth of human connection through a pane of unbreakable glass. After 11 years, Nilsen left the army, holding the rank of corporal. He transitioned briefly into the Metropolitan Police, a startling fact considering his future crimes. He spent less than a year as a police officer in London before resigning, citing a dislike for the culture of the force. He eventually settled into a role as a civil servant, working at a job center in Kentish Town. His job was to help people find work, to listen to their problems, to guide the vulnerable and the lost. By day, he was a helpful, patient bureaucrat. By night, he returned to an empty flat. The loneliness that had haunted him since childhood was now absolute. The uniform was gone. The structure was gone. He was a man drowning in a sea of millions, completely and utterly alone in the sprawling metropolis of London. And the silence of his apartment was becoming unbearable. 195 Melrose Avenue. The tipping point arrived in late 1978. Nilsen had moved into a ground-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, North London. It was a spacious property with a large, unkempt garden. It was here that the dormant seed planted in the parlor in Fraserburgh finally broke through the soil. On the evening of December 30th, 1978, Nilsen went to a pub in the West End, a frequent haunt for him when the loneliness became too sharp to endure. There he met a 14-year-old runaway named Stephen Holmes. Holmes was exactly the type of person Nilsen would naturally gravitate toward. Vulnerable, adrift, and likely not to be immediately missed. Nilsen offered the boy shelter, warmth, and alcohol. He brought him back to Melrose Avenue. They drank heavily, and Holmes eventually fell asleep. As Nilsen sat watching the sleeping boy, an overwhelming terror seized him. The terror was not of the boy, but of the morning. When the sun came up, the boy would leave, the flat would be empty again. The crushing, suffocating silence would return. Nilsen could not bear the thought of the departure. He fetched a necktie, leaned over the sleeping teenager, and pulled it tight. Holmes fought, thrashing in the dark, but Nilsen overpowered him, strangling him until he fell still, and then drowning him in a bucket of water to ensure the job was done. The morning after, Nilsen awoke to a terrifying reality. There was a dead body in his bed. His initial reaction was profound shock and panic. He hid the body under the floorboards of his living room, terrified of discovery. But as the days passed, the panic subsided, replaced by a dark, twisted sense of comfort. He had crossed the ultimate boundary, and the sky had not fallen. Moreover, he finally had what he wanted. He had a companion. Over the next 3 years, 195 Melrose Avenue became a house of horrors. Nilsen's method became terrifyingly routine. He would frequent pubs in central London, targeting young men. He did not seek out the wealthy or the prominent. He looked for the invisible men of London. Drifters, runaways, drug addicts, and sex workers. Men who had slipped through the cracks of society. He would lure them back to his flat with the promise of a hot meal, endless liquor, and a place to crash. He was polite, articulate, and welcoming. He played records, cooked for them, and poured drink after drink until they slipped into unconsciousness, and then he would kill them. The weapon of choice was almost always a necktie or an electrical cord. After the murder, the truly macabre ritual began. Nilsen did not immediately dispose of the bodies. He stripped them, bathed them, and powdered them. He dressed them in clean clothes. He would place them in armchairs or in his bed. He would watch television with them, talk to them, and sometimes sleep beside them. In his profoundly damaged mind, he had created the perfect relationship. The dead did not argue. They did not demand anything, and most importantly, they never ever walked out the door. The company of the dead. To understand Dennis Nilsen is to confront a paradox that defies ordinary human logic. He was a serial killer who claimed he did not kill out of malice, hatred, or even sadistic pleasure. He killed because he was consumed by a pathological fear of abandonment. He was a man who murdered for company. When interviewing Nilsen after his arrest, police and psychiatrists were struck by his detachment. He spoke of his victims not as enemies, but as cherished companions. He viewed the act of strangulation not as an act of violence, but as a mechanism to freeze time, to transform a fleeting visitor into a permanent resident. The horrifying reality was that he treated the bodies with more care and reverence than he treated the living men. In life, they were flawed, unpredictable, and destined to leave him. In death, they were pristine, compliant, and eternally his. The logistics of keeping multiple corpses in a residential flat were staggering. As bodies began to decompose, the smell became an insurmountable problem. Nilsen utilized the space beneath his floorboards, laying the bodies to rest in a dark subterranean crypt beneath his living room. When the space became too crowded, or when the odor threatened to betray him to his upstairs neighbors, he would bring the bodies up. He would dismember them using the skills he learned in the Army Catering Corps, working methodically in his kitchen. He disposed of the remains in the large garden behind Melrose Avenue. He would build massive bonfires, fueled by wood and rubber tires to mask the scent of burning flesh, and reduce his former companions to ash and bone. Neighbors saw the fires, they smelled the smoke, but in the polite, disconnected society of London in the late 70s, no one asked too many questions. The man at number 195 was just a quiet civil servant who liked his privacy. They had no idea they were breathing in the cremated remains of at least a dozen missing men. The move to Cranley Gardens. By late 1981, the situation at Melrose Avenue had become untenable. The landlord wanted to renovate the property, and Nilsen was offered a buyout to leave. He accepted, moving across North London to the attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. This move sealed his fate. The new flat was entirely unsuited for a serial killer. It was on the top floor, it had no garden, and crucially, it had no floorboards he could easily lift. When Nilsen moved, he brought the remains of his final victims from Melrose Avenue with him, packing bones and flesh into tea chests and suitcases, moving them like ordinary household furniture. Despite the lack of space and the increased risk of detection, the compulsion to kill did not stop. The loneliness was still there, a cavernous void that demanded to be filled. At Cranley Gardens, Nilsen murdered at least 3 more young men: Malcolm Barlow, John Howlett, and his final victim, Stephen Sinclair, a 20-year-old heroin addict who had sought warmth on a cold London night. But disposal at Cranley Gardens was a nightmare. Without a garden for his bonfires, Nilsen had to innovate, and his methods became increasingly desperate and grotesque. He resorted to dismembering the bodies in his bathtub and boiling the flesh in large pots on his kitchen stove to soften it. Once the meat was separated from the bone, he would cut it into small pieces and flush it down the toilet. The bones were hidden in the wardrobe, under the floor, or placed out for the regular household rubbish collection. It was an act of supreme hubris, born of a man who had gotten away with murder for so long he believed himself invincible. He was flushing large quantities of human tissue into a century-old Victorian plumbing system. It was inevitable that the pipes would choke. When the plumbing finally backed up, affecting the other tenants in the building, Nilsen's reaction was astonishing. Instead of fleeing, instead of hiding the evidence, he actually complained to the landlord alongside his neighbors. He wrote letters demanding the drains be cleared. It was as if a part of him, exhausted by the sheer physical and psychological weight of his secrets, actively wanted to be caught. When the dino rod plumber finally lifted that manhole cover, the terrible bloody house of cards collapsed in an instant. The interrogation and the echoes. Once in custody at Hornsey Police Station, Dennis Nilsen did not demand a lawyer. He did not deny the charges. Instead, he simply opened his mouth, and the truth poured out of him in a relentless, monotonous tide. Detectives sat for days, mesmerized and horrified, as the polite civil servant detailed the murders of up to 15 young men. He was meticulous in his descriptions of the mechanics of the murders and the disposal, yet infuriatingly vague about the identities of the men he killed. Because he had targeted drifters, runaways, and the marginalized, many of his victims had never been reported missing. To Nilsen, they were beautiful, anonymous objects. He remembered what records he was playing when they died. He remembered what he cooked for them, but he often could not remember their names. The police launched a massive, grueling investigation to identify the remains recovered from Cranley Gardens and the bone fragments excavated from the garden at Melrose Avenue. It was a painstaking puzzle of forensics, dental records, and desperate pleas to the public. Slowly, the names emerged from the shadows. Kenneth Ockenden, a Canadian tourist; Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old runaway; William Sutherland; Malcolm Barlow. These were not just statistics. They were sons, brothers, and friends whose sudden disappearances had left agonizing voids in the lives of their families. They had walked into the dark of London and simply vanished, swallowed by the quiet man with the gentle voice. The trial of Dennis Nilsen at the Old Bailey in late 1983 was a media sensation. The British public was horrified, not just by the body count, but by the sheer mundane domesticity of the crimes. This wasn't a monster lurking in a dark alley. This was a man who worked at the government office, a man who worried about his dog, a man who watched the evening news while a severed head sat in a pot on his stove. Nilsen pleaded not guilty to murder, claiming diminished responsibility, arguing that his mind had fractured under the weight of his isolation and that he was not fully in control of his actions. The jury, however, did not believe that a man who could so methodically dissect and dispose of bodies lacked the capacity to understand what he was doing. On November 4, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. The Home Secretary later upgraded this to a whole life tariff. Nilsen would never see the outside of a prison wall again. He spent the next 35 years in maximum security, a ghost of his own making, writing reams of self-serving poetry and autobiographical notes, forever trying to explain the unexplainable. He died in prison in May 2018, taking the full, unvarnished truth of his final victim count to the grave. The legacy of Dennis Nilsen is a chilling testament to the dangers of invisibility. He was able to operate for years because he preyed on those society had chosen to ignore. In a rapidly moving, disconnected city, he found the cracks where the vulnerable fall, and he waited at the bottom. The story of the Muswell Hill murderer forces us to look at the strangers we pass on the street, the quiet neighbors we never speak to, and the profound, sometimes lethal weight of human loneliness. It is a reminder that the darkest monsters do not always gnash their teeth. Sometimes they just offer you a drink and ask you to stay.